Good morning, everyone. Today we're starting an entirely new series, which is based on this small pamphlet, which is called Guidelines for Conduct of Members of the Ananda Sevaka Order. But we're going to call it the Ananda Way of Life, because it's more than just for the specific members of that particular way of following Ananda. So, first of all, this is Monday, and on Mondays I remind you that this effort, which we call the mission of the masters, which is to share the teachings of this line of gurus with all those who are receptive to it. It's grown beyond what the community I live in can support easily with personnel and other efforts. And so your support has been what's keeping us going, and I'm extremely grateful for it. You can support through the Patreon website, which is this wonderful way of bringing people who have the desire to help together with creative people. And also you can donate directly by going to my website, Asha Joy. You'll find several ways to do it there. And if you would like to become a subscriber to the YouTube channel, that's extremely helpful for all of the way that social media figures things out. So I invite you to participate in all those ways. So let's now start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to find deep inspiration in this new course of study that we're taking on. Show us the universal principles behind these specific guidelines. Help us all to understand how that which we call Ananda is really a ray of grace, guiding and inspiring sincere souls everywhere to live in attunement with our own highest potential, that we may become instruments of your grace, and we may experience within ourselves the uplifting presence of your love and your joy. Om, peace. Amen. I've been doing these 9 a.m. broadcasts for about a year now, more than a year. I think I started sometime in middle of March, maybe it was April of 2020, and here we are now, the middle of May, so it's been a little bit longer than that. Maybe I started earlier. I don't really recall anymore exactly when I did start. I went into more of a quarantine in the middle of March. That's when our school closed, and when schools closed in our area and everything shifted. It's all rather a blur, and there's no reason to make it less of a blur. But all the time that I've been doing these broadcasts, and once I started picking up different writings of Swami in order to tell a story, I've had this book of guidelines of conduct for members of the Ananda monastic order, and I have, every time a series has ended, I've picked it up and looked at it, because it's very, very good, and I've really wanted to do it, and every time I've closed it and put it down, because I couldn't figure how to make it work, because it's what it says. It's guidelines for members of the Ananda Sevaka order, which is a very, very small group of people in the world. And all of those people who are in that order are living in Ananda communities. But finally, it just occurred to me, just this round, things have their own timing. As I was finishing up the series Live Like the Master, Live Like Yogananda, that what this really is if self-realization is the goal of life, if we are really here to be instruments of God, how do we understand all those other elements of life? And that's what Swamiji put together in this little guideline book. And he wrote this Let me think. What I don't know what the copyright 1987. It says it's been revised several different times, but the essence of it, the real heart and soul of it, has hardly been touched in all that time. So let me give you a little bit of a context about how this came about. I think Swami himself writes it. Let me see exactly what he says here. Let's see. Here, just exactly, this was the sentence I was looking for. These guidelines for conduct, this is Swami's own words in the introduction, have evolved through many years of practical experience. So those are the words that are important. Many people, when they want to develop a community, okay, in 1968, this is all history for dates that many of you weren't even born when this all started, but it's been my life. So I just describe it as if it was yesterday. I find myself doing the kind of thing that old people do a lot, which is my own life experience seems so present to me that I'll make references to things that seem extremely active and relevant. And they just seem like they're part of the story, and only slowly, by the look on the faces of the people around me, some of whom their parents weren't born when I'm talking about these things, I can tell that it sounds very distant to them. But it isn't distant to me, and I'm often the keeper of the memory in the little circles that I move in because my mind works that way. I do remember things vividly. So I'm going to repeat some of that history because it does seem relevant. And this is why history is relevant, it seems to me. Because if you come into a situation, and something like Ananda, or the teachings of Master, the way it's expressed through Ananda, it looks like a fixed reality. And to a certain extent it is, because time, much practical experience has brought understandings. We're not just shooting in the dark. We're not just crossing our fingers and hope it works. We're not just having failed experiment after failed experiment. There's decades of real effort here that have resulted in a lot that you can see. My sitting here is part of that, in the house that I live in the community that I helped to found, that's now been here for 30 years, and so on. But what we have to understand is that the Ananda doesn't exist as a material entity, even though we now have buildings and books and all kinds of things. Ananda exists as an uplifting vibration that presents the consciousness of this line of masters to sincere individuals who are receptive to those vibrations. And that's really all it is. Because as soon as it stops being that, it stops fulfilling the purpose for which it was made. And every tradition, every way of behavior, every building that's been created, everything was only made to facilitate the transmission of that ray of grace. And the transmission of that ray of grace is by no means automatic. It's not like you can just sort of put it on from the outside. You can't just go to the place and become someone else. You become transformed when we are receptive, to all those who received him. That's how John put it in the Bible, and I must quote that every single time I sit in front of this camera. I hear myself saying it because it's the bottom line story. And Swami Kriyananda, when he wrote the Festival of Light, when he received the Festival of Light, which is the ritual that in America and in Europe we do every Sunday morning, he included that line because it is the whole statement. Not to all those who followed the rules, not to all those who stand in the place, not to all those who wear the T-shirt or whatever it's supposed to be, None of that transforms our consciousness. The only thing that transforms it is when we receive the energy within ourselves. So the only purpose of everything we do is to be helpful to people. And but it does help, to share your experience. And the other thing I was going to say is that if we understand the purpose for which things were created, then we can relate to them more dynamically, and we can also appreciate their applicability. We can appreciate why. Instead of just looking at it as a fixed form, we can see it as an extension of dynamic energy. So the history of what I'm going to be talking about for the next, it'll be probably several months, it'll take me to go through this. The history of this was, and this is where I was starting, when Swamiji in 1968 acquired land and began what has become the whole entity of Ananda Sangha, which is now a worldwide organization which serves in countless ways. He was following a commission, an inspiration that Master himself had, as Swami said, planted in the ether. I think it was the year 1949 at a garden party in Beverly Hills. Master was there, and there were some 800 guests, and Master gave a talk, which Swami describes in The Path, about, thousands of youths must go north, south, east, and west to cover the world with little colonies, intentional spiritual communities that show that playing, living, and high thinking lead to the greatest happiness. And Master, one of his original aims and ideals when he came to America was to found spiritual communities that would be not only for monks and nuns. There have always been spiritual communities for monks and nuns, for hundreds of years, but also where householders, individuals, married couples, and married couples with children could all live lives of total dedication to God, because this is a Dwapara Yuga phenomenon, which is where in Kali Yuga, spiritual life and what people would think of as normal life were strictly separated. In Dwapara Yuga, the separation of many things is blended in the understanding that it's all a flow of energy. And Swamiji at that garden party felt that this was a personal call to him. And he'd had interest in community since the age of 15. When he was 15 years old and the Second World War was raging, and he was just heartsick at the destruction and the hatred and the separation that was being inculcated into people, he felt deeply within himself that there had to be a better way to live. So he started thinking in his mind about building intentional communities based on high principles. This was like 7 years before he met his guru. And he said his friends were all interested until they realized he was serious. It was one thing to have late night conversation about it, but Swamiji really wanted to do it. So he was thrilled when he discovered that his guru had the same ideal. Of course, Swami was born for the task. But when he started Ananda, there was no precedent for it. Master had actually tried to start a householder community in Encinitas during his own lifetime, but it was too soon, is how Master himself felt it. Too soon after the Depression in America, because he was trying to do it in America. He said families were just not able to expand beyond what Master called us four and no more. And there was a certain tension between the monastics and the householders in the community Master was trying to form, and he had to give it up. But he indicated the importance that he felt in the community ideal by the effort he himself made to start one. So it was just one more incentive for Swamiji. That community started and ended before Swami ever came to Master. But in a Master's lifetime, as Swamiji puts it, often the master just plants seeds, and his own lifetime is too short, or his priorities are too different for him to apply the necessary energy to every initiative. But the fact that he launches them also is a message to disciples coming in future generations that these are directions that the Guru himself saw is how the grace can manifest in this world, because that's all we're talking about, is the grace manifesting in this world. So when Swamiji started Ananda, Swami himself had a very clear sense of how this energy could manifest. He'd visited communities all over the world and had spent years thinking about this, paying attention to what worked and what didn't, studying human nature, just trying to understand the possibility. But still, some people, when they start a community specifically, now I lived through the 60s and the 70s when a lot of people in America were going back to the land and starting communities. And during the heyday of that time, the average lifespan, so we were told, of a new community was, I think it was 30 days. It might have been a crashing 60, but I think it was just 30 before one thing or another just blew the community apart. And of the many that tried to launch, large and small, during that time, a tiny handful endured, Ananda being one of them. But many times when people start a community, they write the rules first. This is what we're based on, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to decide what we have for dinner, this is how work is going to be organized, this is the work we're going to do. Swamiji was trained in a different way, the way he describes that Master worked. Master had a clear idea of the consciousness that he wanted to express, and he followed every opportunity that was in tune with that flow of consciousness. So you have the inner awareness first, and then you observe and you guide that inner awareness rather than starting with the fixed reality of what it's supposed to be like and then try to make people conform to that fixed reality. Swami was a brilliant leader in countless ways. And of course, his attunement to Master and his elevated spiritual consciousness made it possible for him to hold the energy, because his aura and his magnetism were so expanded. He could hold the energy without it having much form, whereas most people need more form in order to hold the energy. But Swamiji didn't. I mean, and among the things that he taught us was how to hold the energy with as little form as possible. Master himself instructed Swami, don't make too many rules. It destroys the spirit. So Ananda operated, we had very few rules. One of them was, the primary one was, at the time, was absolutely no drugs, no drug-induced, what they call now recreational drugs. It wasn't no medicine. But at that time, the spiritual movement, the back to the land movement, was all embroiled with psychedelics and marijuana. And we were absolutely not that. So no use of so-called recreational drugs on or off the property. It had to be a clear line. So that was very strong. Also, because everything started at Ananda village, where we were out in the woods and there were lots of wildlife, having dogs proved quite impossible because they barked and could be heard all over and they chased the wildlife. So we had no drugs and no dogs. And that was pretty close to it for many, many, many years. And so what Swami worked to train us to be disciples, because that's what we were there to do. You know, and all of this gradually became very clear. It was less clear at the very beginning, but it gradually became clear that we were there to serve this one ray of grace, and we were there to be in tune with that one ray of grace. And Swami himself watched to see how that was going to evolve. We meditated, we learned and were initiated by Swamiji into Kriya. Swami started writing music. We started singing that music. We did the chants that Master taught. We did the meditation techniques that were all related to that. Just sort of step by step. And by getting in tune with that ray of grace, and by gradually coming to appreciate the importance of getting in tune with that ray of grace, a whole way of life began to develop. And it was the spontaneous expression of, if self-realization is our goal, and if our path to that self-realization is attunement with this line of masters, what would life look like? And there was a lot of disagreement in the first, I wasn't that much a part of it. There were, like Ananda, the location in Nevada County, which is now called Ananda Village, had three parts to it. One was what is now called the meditation, well, I guess it was called, we called it the meditation retreat, the seclusion retreat, the meditation retreat, the more isolated piece of property where it started, what is now called the village, the community, and where Swami lives, which is called Ayodhya. The retreat and Ayodhya were always in the flow with Swamiji. There's like the people who chose to live there, and just the way it worked out, that group was always in tune with Swamiji. The village itself, which was really the householder part of it, and where the children lived, was a little harder to wrangle. And the thing about a community is, you can't have one unless you have people. You can't sort of be a hermit and then call yourself a community. And when Swami was trying to develop something that had never been developed before, at a time when lots of people had a general interest in what he was doing, the village area had more ups and downs in its development. Personally, I only ever lived at the retreat and at Ayodhya. I lived on that land for 16 years, and I never lived in the village area, and I was never really involved in all the wrangling that took place. By the grace of God, Jyotish, as an absolute angel, was with that, and then Devi with him after they got married, which was very early in the saga of Ananda in the early 70s. And that went through many rockier steps as as the community itself developed a self-definition. That's how Swami put it. We have to gradually develop a self-definition. And we were sort of at a crisis point in 1976 when most of that area burned to the ground. And it was, I write about this in Light Bearer. Things had were coming to a crisis point between how Swami knew that it had to evolve and how many of the residents wanted it to evolve. There was no meeting of the minds. Swami wasn't sure how it would resolve. And then Divine Mother sent this forest fire. And it basically burned to the ground almost all the houses there. And so everyone who saw Ananda as a beautiful place to live where they had their own little house, they didn't have their own little house anymore. And Ananda wasn't beautiful there anymore because it had all just burned to the ground. All of those who saw Ananda as a ray of grace realized that it didn't matter that everything had burned to the ground because no fire can touch the ray of grace. And so it moved the energy a great deal in the direction that we needed to go. And many of the people who left, all of the people who left, were all good people who had uplifted positive ideas. They just weren't in tune with what we were trying to do. So after 1976, it's sort of like a huge resolution had come, and we began to move forward. And then in the early 80s, an odd thing happened, but Divine Mother has her ways, which is our accountants the people who were managing the money, the financial managers, were looking for ways to economize. And they found out that we were a spiritual community. There was no question about that. But if we could become recognized by the IRS as an official monastic order, it would save us thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars every year in taxes because we could go into another tax category. So the financial manager spoke to Swami about it, and it became a very interesting idea because the truth of it was we were a monastic order. The commitment that people had in living there was the same commitment as if we'd gone into some Catholic order somewhere. It was just this ray of grace according to our guru. So there was a senior, what you would call a senior council within Ananda. Swamiji had always organized it in this way that at that time, that the land was actually owned by what in America is actually a church, a religious nonprofit entity called the Yoga Fellowship. It was called then. It had several different names over time. And you could be a member of the community and a resident of the community within a year, but you had to be there at least 5 years to become a member of the Yoga Fellowship, and you had to be voted in by the other members. And the land was actually owned by that entity. And Swami always had that in mind so that a big influx of newcomers wouldn't be able to take the community away from what those who were deeper into it. And then that group became kind of a senior council, is the only way I can think of it. And we would meet once a year. And we all lived there at that time. There was no other Ananda to live on except that one. Actually, by the 1979, we had the San Francisco house and Ocean Song. So we did have 2 others, and Sacramento by then. But the Yoga Fellowship would meet every year, and people by then would come from wherever else they were living. And Swami would introduce new initiatives, and we would all talk about it. And we were democratic in the sense that all voices were respected, but we were also disciples. So the intention was not to get my way, but to collectively, respectfully hear each other's inspiration to see if we could feel within that the higher guidance of the divine. And of course, Swamiji played a big role, but Swamiji would always, when he had a new idea, he would introduce it. He would tell us what he was thinking, why he was thinking. He would also tell us what he saw as the positive and what he saw as the negative. He never said, "Master told me to do this, so we have to do it," even though Swamiji never introduced anything that was important and serious unless he felt a powerful impulse from Master to do it. But Swami changed his mind. He would change his mind from information that people would give him, and he would change his mind from perceiving that people were not receptive to what he wanted, because it did no good for him to want it. He had to awaken within us an independent, dynamic understanding of why this was a good idea, because otherwise it was a one-man show. And the entire and only purpose of Ananda is to provide an opportunity for those who wish to be able to become in tune with this ray of grace. So if Swami was in tune with it and he could say what was right, and all the rest of us were just either, just his mindless minions or his suppressed rebels, who didn't want it, but he was insisting, none of that would fulfill what we were doing. So in the early 80s, I think it was 85, 84, 85, it was introduced, this idea that we could become a formal monastic order. And it took us 2 years to make the decision. The first year it was introduced, and then the second year the decision was made, because it was too important a direction to do it lightly. Now, I haven't finished everything I have to say by any means. But that's all I'm going to talk about today. And tomorrow I'll pick up the narrative where I left it off. God bless you.